Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Richardson. Just a little bit about myself. I've I don't come from like a finance or a computer science background. I was actually trained as an organic chemist. So I have my Bachelor of Science from Macquarie University in Sydney. I did my PhD at the University of Melbourne under Spencer Williams at the Bio 21 Institute. I've completed my first postdoc at the University of California, Irvine, where I also taught um, the first and second year organic chemistry classes for 2 years. I came back to Australia at the end of 2018. Started working for the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization in 2019, which was my second postdoctoral appointment. And I was awarded a CERC postdoctoral fellowship while I was there. And going into 2020, I received a grant from the German government, from the DAAD, to go and do about a year of research, which was like kind of critical to my research project at the time. And I was supposed to arrive in Berlin sometime in April of 2020, which was about a few weeks into the pandemic and just a little after Australia closed its borders to international travel. And so the city that I was living in eventually went into what turned out to be a 24-month contiguous lockdown period. And so I had to sort of abandon my research project, which was heartbreaking, and also, start finding other ways to be productive. And so I turned my attention to cryptocurrency and especially DeFi. I was a DAO, like a DAO member, just a community member, for the first, or yeah, for from about June onwards, in 2020. Just the lockdown measures were getting more and more draconian. And so I was active in I was active in the Kyber community. I was active in a few others, MakerDAO. But the Bancor community was the one that sort of I found the most interesting. I met the Bancor founders there, and we were discussing sort of the fundamentals of the technology and how to improve it, what some of the challenges are, including how to make them financially performant, and also just sort of the changing culture and landscape of how people interact with AMMs, and whether or not there are better bonding curves that can be created to that sort of that represent the interests of the people that are interacting with them. And so at around about sort of December of 2020, one of the founders reached out and asked me why I've got so much time to spend, working on the protocol with them, because I was still a volunteer at that point. And I explained my situation with respect to the pandemic and everything else. And then the next day they reached out with an offer for a full-time contract, which I decided to take. And so I joined the core contributors as a full-time contractor in January of 2021. And shortly thereafter, I was leading the research program in the organization. And after the meltdown that we had during a bank run on an insurance protocol that we had developed in June of last year, I developed a new set of novel bonding curves that now power the new product from Bancor that we call Carbon, which is a way of organizing the contract such that an order book-like structure becomes an emergent property of the system, which is quite nice. But yeah, after developing that protocol, I was offered the CEO position within the organization directly from the foundation, which I took in October of last year. And so I've been essentially the project lead ever since. I've spent a very large amount of time studying the sort of the development of the bonding curve and AMM space. I think I arrived at just the right time, because I think if I had joined the space any earlier than I had, there might not be too much too much to make it feel interesting or like it's progressing technology or an active field of research. But the time that I joined was kind of around about the time when, the curve white paper, for example, was just getting was just getting some traction and attention. And there were things that people were doing, and new AMM designs coming out all the time. And so I think I don't I would be reluctant to call myself too much of an authority on the subject, but I do think I belong to that category of individuals that have dedicated a significant swathe of the last few years, really understanding how these things work and what their economic and financial impacts are and things like that. And so it's delightful to be here and chatting with you guys. And if there's anything that you would like me to slow down on at any point, please just keep it informal. Just feel free to stop me and we can talk at any time. And so I've agreed to three seminars, and this is mostly because I would do more. I just have way too much on my plate right now, so I don't want to sort of overextend myself, and I have great respect for this group, and so I want to make sure that I deliver something that's worth your time. So I'm trying to keep it to 3, and I have divided the subject material roughly into 3 categories. And so the first of these 3 presentations is going to be the seminal archetypes. So basically looking at where these bonding curves came from, what they were supposed to do, what they were designed to do. We might talk a little bit about the history, some anecdotal things that you guys might find interesting along the way. The second presentation, which is going to be next week, we're going to start looking at advanced iterations of the same idea. And I really want to underscore that sameness of the idea. So we'll be looking at things like concentrated liquidity, including, by the way, versions of concentrated liquidity that have never been deployed. So, models that you can, basically the natural extension of the model under a concentrated liquidity paradigm, even though I've never seen it published or discussed anywhere. So if you guys are interested in seeing, what novel bonding curve or model, how to naturally extend these systems might look, especially in like n-dimensional space, presentation 2, I think, is going to be very interesting for you. And then presentation 3 will be looking at what I'm calling exotic bonding curves. So these will be things that don't really derive from the same Cobb-Douglas type production functions. Things like maybe the curve stable swap formula, including the stable swap formula that's implemented by Solidly, which is interesting, but equivalent in some ways. And also, other stable swap variations that we can just kind of develop for fun by ourselves. And so this is essentially the way I'm looking at it. I've made it sound like presentation 3 is going to be exclusively about stable swap formulas. I don't mean it to be. I haven't written that presentation yet, so we'll see when we get there. But basically, so presentations 1 and 2 are going to be about the real core, right, of how AMMs and bonding curves are deployed today. And then number 3 is going to be at, what does it even mean to have a bonding curve, and how far can we really push the limits of using these invariant functions to create something that represents an exchange of value, or, an exchange of goods, or however you want to think about it. Even things like exchanging time might be a concept that we visit. So without taking too much longer, I do want to kick this presentation off, which is the seminal archetype. And for those who aren't familiar, Bancor is the project that developed the concept of the bonding curve, of liquidity pools and of pool tokens. And so this is really some of the math that we're going to be visiting today. But I'm sure that many of you will have already seen a lot of this before. So I'm going to deliver it in a way that I think that you haven't seen before, which is going actually to what was published, and really sort of expanding on the way that these ideas were expressed, and basically translating the equations and concepts as they appear in the original patent, and transforming them in sort of into like a modern interpretation, a modern context. So with that in mind, I think it's important that we have a think about let's say a convention that we're going to use for all three of these seminars. Because you'll find across the industry, we have kind of gravitated towards one way of describing these kinds of systems. But there are some, quirks and differences that you'll find between different ways of speaking about the same ideas, the same way that you will in sort of any, any written mathematics. And so what I'm trying to do here is to make sure that we agree on what it means when we describe certain actions or when we define a certain variable. So in this particular case, you'll see here that I've got two different swaps. This is an exchange where we've got this this cylindrical shape that's representing the liquidity pool, with the A token moving into that liquidity pool and the B token being extracted from it. And so this would be an exchange of A for B. And the box with the brain in it is just the smart contract logic. And I will sometimes use this if I need to refer to something conceptually, but generally that thing is the least important aspect of these slides. And then the converse of that system is to exchange B for A, right? The exact reverse situation. But this isn't the only thing that we need to think about when it comes to bonding curves and how they're implemented, because the account keeping of these systems is just as important, in my opinion, as the function that they were designed to facilitate, which is exchange. And so I'm going to be using these kinds of conventions, right, where we've got a liquidity pool where A is being added to the pool, and then a liquidity pool token is being issued for the user as a type of receipt. And so if you haven't, I'm sure that you guys have seen this before, but maybe haven't seen it quite presented this way. You may be used to, for example, the conventions that have been introduced by Uniswap, where you must add at least two tokens. So if there's a two token pool, you have to add both of those tokens at the same time. But just know that that restriction was introduced by Uniswap later. The original implementation of these systems had no such restriction. You could add just one token and still be issued an LP token in return. You didn't need to add both at the same time. And this is one of the things that we'll start covering. So these are the three sort of canonical examples. You can add one token, it doesn't matter which one, so A or B in this case, or you can add A and B together and in any ratio, and that will generate a liquidity pool token for the user. And then, of course, the opposite of that action is the act of removing liquidity. So this is when the person who has either previously received a receipt, that LP token, is now relinquishing it back to the system in exchange for tokens that are in the liquidity pool. Now, again, if you're only familiar with, for example, the Uniswap contracts, you might assume that it's necessary that LP token must be exchanged for both of the tokens inside a liquidity pool, or in the case of Balancer, that it must be exchanged for all of the tokens in the liquidity pool in whatever ratio and whatever weight they currently exist in. But again, these are restrictions that have been added after the fact. In the original embodiment in Bancor V1, no matter how many assets were in a pool, you could exchange your liquidity pool token for any one of those assets. It didn't have to be the basket, or it didn't have to be the entire basket. It could just be a subset of the basket, or even one individual pool token. So this is kind of how I'm trying to express that. Yes, Octopus.
Thank you so much. I have a question about if you know why Uniswap added that requirement, because at least in Uniswap's system, you could use selective addition and removal of liquidity for price manipulation. Were there actually any attacks that used that, or was it just they recognized that it was needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they did it. So it would be difficult for me to put words in Hayden's mouth. But I think the reason he did it that way was because he wasn't sure how to do it in the single token sense or in the n-dimensional sense. So like the original Uniswap V2 V1 contracts were all two token pools, right? They didn't have and they didn't do the n-dimensional thing. It was always two, and it was always with ETH as the counterpart token, similar to in Bancor how BNT was used as the counterpart token. Now you do get some advantages by requiring that both tokens are added simultaneously, especially if one of them is ETH, because as part of the transaction there is a like an MS like a message amount. And so the transaction itself is kind of self-reporting the amount of ETH that's coming with it. And so you can kind of piggyback off of the transaction itself to do, part of the calculation. So you don't have to, for example, read the amount of the other token coming in or putting that into another calculation. So you do get some streamlining effects, especially when ETH is one of the requisite tokens. Now you lose some of that efficiency when you move into from something like Uniswap V1 to Uniswap V2. So when you move into Uniswap V2, it was no longer a requirement that ETH had to be the thing in the liquidity pool. And you can have a look when you sort of look, when you sort of dig into the Uniswap V2 contracts, that kind of introduced some problems. So some of the programming tricks that were being used to issue pool tokens and retrieve liquidity from the pool in exchange for a pool token that they were doing with ETH, they would always refer exclusively to the ETH balance, right? You don't even care what the other token is. And so there was no process to measure both. Whereas in Uniswap V2, because they no longer had the safety of that assumption, they then did have to be more careful about how these tokens were being handled. And you mentioned price manipulation, and you're absolutely correct. There are many ways that you can have a price manipulation attack. I think the most significant one is that someone can, instead of interacting with the wrapper functions that control the issuance of liquidity pool tokens when tokens are coming into liquidity pool, there are ways that you can actually subvert that system and just inject liquidity directly into the liquidity pool. Now, the reason why you might do that, like you're effectively donating tokens to the pool, which is not great. And that will affect the price quote that the system is reporting. But more importantly, it means that if you're providing liquidity in one token or the other token, or which token you're using to measure the LP token issuance, can actually dramatically change whether or not you're getting the true pro rata share or a much greater share of the LP token supply when you're adding that liquidity in. So I think, and I know this was a slightly long-winded explanation, is that in Uniswap V1, there was a lot of safety because you know that ETH is coming with every single transaction. And so there's a very efficient way that you can calculate the LP token issuance that is effective. I don't want to say unhackable, but is not susceptible to the same types of manipulation attacks that Uniswap V2 was susceptible to. Now, rather than, while addressing those problems, make it so that you can, get one token back or the other token or both tokens together or some ratio thereof. I think that the consumer base that was using that system already was already so adjusted to the idea of you provide tokens in both simultaneously and it has to match the ratio inside the pool. And when you remove liquidity, it also comes out in the same ratio. And so I think rather than introduce this extra complexity, I think that the choice to keep it simple was probably what helped Uniswap resonate with the market for longer periods of time. But that's, again, speculating. I was not part of those conversations, and they've never really discussed why they haven't had multi-dimensional swaps or why they require the exact pro rata stake to be implemented. It could be for security reasons. It could be for program simplicity. Could be for a bunch of reasons. It could be for market fit. It's not entirely clear.
Thank you for that. Very helpful.
My pleasure. Okay, so syntax. So when I'm going to be using the symbols X and Y, I want you to, it's important that you realize that it doesn't matter, like I'm not referring to a specific token necessarily. I am referring to it by the action that is being performed. For example, in this case, you'll see that I've got a swap from A to B being performed and from B to A. And the token that is being introduced into the pool, I'm always going to denominate as X, as the symbol X. And the other token, the one that's being removed from the liquidity pool, I'm always going to be denoting as Y, right? So essentially, no matter which token, A or B, the trader is is interacting with, we're going to say that the token that is coming from the user to the pool is delta X, or the number of tokens coming from the user to the pool is always delta X, and the number of tokens coming from the pool to the user is always delta Y. And this has a couple of advantages in setting it up this way, just in terms of clarity of communication. But also it means that we can just decide here, and this is just a declaration, that we're always going to make sure that those numbers, delta X and delta Y, are always positive. And again, this is just by convention that we're going to do this. That doesn't change the equations very much if you allow these things to, I have often decided that we should do everything from like the liquidity pool perspective. And so delta X is always positive and delta Y is always negative. And that's kind of the physicist in me liking to sort of, keep account of where things are using a single frame of reference. That having this kind of moving frame of reference is very helpful because it means that we can, we know, especially from a smart contract and programming perspective, we know that we're always dealing with positive numbers and we don't need to, lose half of the magnitude of the numbers that we're storing because we need to denote one of those bits for sign. So basically, this convention means that one, we don't care about the specific token. We only care about what type of token it is, right? Is it the one that's being traded into the pool or out of the pool? And we're going to make sure that everything is a positive number. And you'll find that generally across the industry, that is pretty well respected. So just as an example of how I'm going to use this, and to delineate the X balance of tokens that the user might hold from the X balance of tokens that the pool might hold, I'm going to be using the subscripts U and P. And so in this particular case, you'll see that, at time 0, the user has some quantity of X and Y tokens, the pool has some quantity of X and Y tokens, and the pool reserve ratios. And if you're not familiar with this because you've only had a look at constant product or something like that, don't worry, we'll be getting into that during the seminar series. But essentially, there's no need to denote these with U or P because they refer to something that's explicit to the pool and not really shared by both parties. So in this case, as time moves forwards, the user balance of X is always going to go down by delta X. So delta X is always subtracted from the user balance. Delta Y is always going to be added to the user balance, and then the opposite is going to be true in the pool's case. And this is effectively how it's going to be represented in the equations. Now, liquidity provision gets a little bit more complex because now we have to introduce a third token, a minimum of a third token. And we also need to introduce the concept of the LP token supply. And in the language of the Banco patent, we also need to introduce something called the market capitalization of the LP token. We'll get to that in a minute. But for now, just know that when we're talking about liquidity being added, and it doesn't matter which token it's in, the delta X and delta Y, right? Whatever these tokens are, they're always going to be subtracted from the user balance, which means that delta X and delta Y themselves are always going to be positive numbers. The LP token, we're going to introduce as the letter Z. And so delta Z will always refer to either the user's balance of that token or the total amount of LP tokens that there are, right? The contract balance of that token. And so I'm going to use Z subscript T to refer to the total amount of LP tokens in existence, and again, using the subscript U to refer to the user balance. So if you're providing tokens, for example, in just A, the user token amount is going to go down by delta A, or by delta X, and the user is receiving some amount of Z tokens representing the LP token, which is always going to be a positive number, positive delta Z in this case. And so if the user's providing liquidity in just whatever X is or just whatever Y is, then that's the only balance that's going to be affected. But of course, we're going to be looking at situations, at least hypothetically, where you can provide both of these tokens and in any ratio, in any composition, to get the LP token in return. And then again, the opposite of this situation is the relinquish to relinquish the LP token back to the system and receive tokens in return. And so again, delta Z is always going to be a positive number, which means that we're going to be subtracting it from the user balance in this case, and also subtracting it from the LP token supply. Oh, which is something that, if you're, I skipped over because I know that you guys are familiar with it, but just in case this, ends up on YouTube or something and people aren't familiar, when LP tokens are issued, they are minted from nothingness and given to the user. So you'll note that in the case where we were issuing LP tokens, both the user balance and the LP token supply is always increasing by the same amount, right? So that delta Z value is added both to the user balance and to the LP token supply. And then the other way around, when we're exchanging the LP token for the tokens in the liquidity pool, then the amount of LP tokens that is being subtracted from the user balance must be the same amount of tokens that's being lost from the LP token supply at the same time. And similarly, as we're receiving tokens from the liquidity pool, then those are being added to the user balance, and the same amount must be subtracted from the pool balance. And I'm sorry if that sounded like we're at the end of it, thank God. And I'm sorry if that was boring, but I think it's going to be very helpful to be able to sort of refer back to some of this nomenclature as we get deeper and deeper into deeper and deeper into the seminar series. Okay, so rather paradoxically, the conventions that I've just shown you, these are a modern invention, right? This is the thing that has kind of emerged from the industry over the last couple of years. It's like the best way to write about things. Certainly because I think the invariant function has become the most familiar way of visualizing or thinking about these exchange algorithms, and certainly the bonding curve has become front and center, but that wasn't always the case. When the Banco formula was invented, it was really the interaction between the liquidity that a user is providing or removing and the LP token. This really is the nature of the invention. It's really the only thing that's being spoken about in the patent. And so when you have a look through some of the old literature, maybe some of the old blog posts, some of the old interviews from the original Banco founders, you'll hear them referring to a smart token, or occasionally, for a very brief period of time, it was called a relay token. This was, just know that this is absolutely synonymous with a pool token. It's exactly the same concept. It was just known by a different name. And so if you have a look at, this is the PCT application. This is exactly how it's expressed. And so what I'm going to do for you now is to have a look at what these equations mean and try and get them back into something familiar. And so, for example, one of the things that we can do very quickly is just do a straight substitution and then rearrangement to take the syntax that's used in the patent documents and convert it into the modern understanding. So this equation is exactly the same thing. This FT component here is literally the issuance of the pool token. So this is that delta Z that we were talking about in the slides above. TT, or capital T subscript little t, this is the total supply of the LP token, right? The contract supply of the LP token. And so in our context, this is going to be Z subscript T and so on. So there's a literal one-to-one correspondence for these things. Obviously, I've rearranged the equation a little bit to basically expand out this fraction addition, so that we have it like this. This is just a preference of mine. I find it easier to rearrange some of the equations when it's done this way, particularly because it makes it explicit just when you're looking at the equation or teaching it to someone, that the thing that matters here is that delta x is the thing that's like going up, right? That we're adding some amount of delta x to some existing pool balance of that token. And I just find that presentation to be slightly easier, more intuitive to understand. Now, this second equation, the one underneath it, all I've done is to rearrange the top equation. Okay, so this is why we're getting two equations out of it. So the first equation is really your input is delta x, right? This is some user who is adding some quantity of, maybe the A token, maybe the B token, but they're adding some amount of tokens to the liquidity pool in just one of those reserves. And we're asking the question, how many pool tokens are they going to be issued as a result of that interaction? But it doesn't have to be that way, right? We could have also asked if the user wanted to receive explicitly a certain number of pool tokens, right? If they want to purchase some pool tokens from the exchange. And in some of the original documents, you'll see that the pool token was referred to as a type of ETF. So you could literally invest in that ETF with whatever tokens you had. You didn't have to try and get the basket together. You just basically buy the ETF with whatever you have, which is roughly how ETFs work in the modern context as well. But in this case, that number of pool tokens that you're trying to purchase is the input value, and now we're trying to calculate whatever quantity of tokens is required in the chosen denomination in order to receive that amount of pool tokens. And wouldn't be a bonding curve research group without looking at a graph of this. But just be aware that it's not the familiar case, right? We are looking at the case where we're adding exactly one, like we're only adding one of these tokens. But it still performs in roughly the same way that you would expect, or maybe the same way that you would expect. So remember here, we're only adding, for example, the A token, which means that if we add a lot of A tokens to the pool, eventually its reserve is going to overwhelm the reserve of whatever the other token is, maybe the B token, or if there are other tokens in the pool, it might overwhelm all of them. And so it kind of makes sense that as its supply is increasing, then its purchasing power for the pool token is going down. And that's really what this graph is trying to represent, is that as as one of these token reserves comes to overwhelm the total liquidity inside the pool, then the rate of issuance of the pool token is going to decline. And so this is, I would say, it's an unfamiliar bonding curve, but it's a really important one, right? We're used to seeing a bonding curve being expressed entirely in terms of the reserves inside a smart contract. But it's totally legitimate, and I would say even helpful, to have a look at a bonding curve with respect to the issuance of the pool token from nothingness. So something that's not not in a steady supply, and having a look at that relationship that way. For people who've been paying attention, the Friendtech like key issuance algorithm is very, very similar to this. I think there's another couple of parameters in there, but otherwise it is mimicking this kind of issuance pattern. So equation 2 is the opposite. So this is, if that first equation is what it looks like to be adding liquidity in one token only, then the second equation is what it looks like to be removing liquidity in one token. And again, a slightly unfamiliar way of examining a familiar situation, but I assure you, when we get into it, that it will feel more and more familiar. So again, the first equation up here, the top equation in the modern conventions, is kind of a verbatim switch of all of the variables that we don't like because of the sort of archaic way that they're presented, and substituting them out for more familiar, more modern variations of it. One of the things that I didn't point out in the last equation, but I'll point it out here, is that the way that it's written originally has this like absolute value around the right-hand side. And the reason why we don't need it when we're using the modern conventions is because we have explicitly defined things like delta z and delta x to be positive numbers. Whereas when you're using it in this sense, it's basically expressing that same condition, but just in a slightly more concise way, maybe even a slightly more outdated way. But it's the same thing. And then again, the bottom equation is just the rearrangement of the top equation to isolate delta z, so that we can ask the same sorts of questions. So the top one is, if I relinquish a certain number of pool tokens back to the system, and burn those pool tokens, then how many of this token that I am choosing am I going to receive in return? And separately, if I want a certain number of this token from the pool, right, maybe the A token especially, then how many pool tokens do I need to give it in order to receive that quantity? And you'll see that this has a similar shape. The other one definitely looked quadratic, but if you remember, it was quadratic with its vertex probably like situated at the y-axis, right? But here you can see it's got this same sort of quadratic or square root sort of profile, but it's tapering off asymptotically in the y direction. So they're, in a way, they're kind of equal and opposite curves. Like they're not exactly, but it's a helpful way to think about it. But I'm not sure how intuitive that is. But it kind of reminds me of the difference between having a gradient versus its inverse gradient, where one of those is a straight line and the other one is definitely not a straight line. Octopus.
Are you having to choose an r sub x parameter value here, or does the specific value of r sub x not matter in creating the curve?
Of course it does, but you could, I've deliberately left off the scale on these axes. And that's really what Rx does, right? So if you choose Rx as a parameter, and absolutely this is something you choose, in a constant product situation, this would always be 1/2. But it can be any number, like the 2080 pool, for example, in Balancer, our Rx is 0.2 and Ry is like 0.8. But even under those conditions, by rescaling the axes, you can still get it back to to be this shape. So yeah, in a way, these weights are just the scaling factor that you're applying to each dimension, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Okay, and this is the third equation in the IP claim, and in a way, it's the most significant one. Because it solves the accounting system, right? The accounting problem that was really paramount, I think, in everyone's minds, at least from a research perspective, before we even gave DeFi a name, right? So just this idea of how do you build a smart contract that is that's relatively lightweight, very efficient on computing resources, but is still able to keep track of all of the value that it owes to all of these different users, right? And you can appreciate that in a naive sense, when you're approaching that problem, the only real reference material that you have is things like SQL databases and other things where you've got specific specific users with transaction records and things like that. And so you might have thought that we can use things like the UTXO system from Bitcoin or something like that, but it really wasn't clear. And this is essentially the solution that Bancor sort of settled down on. And it turns out it's quite a good one, because it's the one that has been adopted by the rest of the industry. So I want to explain what this function means, because in the in the original literature, it is nice and compact, right? It's just a simple fraction. This capital T subscript P is the price of the pool token. TR is the balance of that specific token in the liquidity pool. TT is the total amount of pool tokens in existence, and RR is the reserve ratio weighting. And so, okay, how do we get to that from the modern interpretations? So these you may recognize these two functions here as being the one of these is the add liquidity in one pool in one token only. And the other one is the remove liquidity in one token only. And what I'm trying to do here is, if I'm trying to work out what the price of a pool token is, right? If we go back up to this graph, you can see here that it's pretty clear that as I add more and more pool tokens, right? As I increase that delta Z value that I'm looking to relinquish back to the system in exchange for one of those tokens inside the liquidity pool, that it's forming it forms this beautiful curve. And at any point on this curve, if we take a tangent line, then we can see that, okay, at that point, there is a certain number of tokens, a certain marginal price, if you like, of the pool token with respect to any of the tokens in its supply. And that is, I think, the thing that never really doesn't really get a lot of attention today, because it's kind of taken for granted, but at the time was like the most significant advancement in what the bonding curve is. And that is, in a sense, that the pool token has this sort of self-reporting function. And so what I'm just showing you here is that it doesn't matter if we're adding liquidity or removing liquidity. The limit as the change in the pool token supply goes to 0 is the same. And so we can simplify this out pretty easily to just say that the marginal rate of pool token issuance, or the marginal rate of liquidity pool token being emitted from or admitted to the liquidity pool as a function of the pool token issuance or destruction, is equal to the amount of tokens inside the pool divided by the total amount of pool tokens that exist times the reserve ratio. So this is literally a straight up substitution of the published equation. So we've managed to substitute in some new conventions, and then using those conventions, we've then taken the limit of the pool token issuance or destruction, and have ended up back in a system that's using the familiar syntax, so that we don't have to deal with this anymore. Now, this is that coming back to that market capitalization idea, and again, this is the thing that you will see spoken about, referred to in some of the early literature. And again, the thing that I think is is not well appreciated today, but was back then. And this is that if you've got that pool token and you've got the liquidity pool, you can know the market capitalization of this pool token is, because it's always going to be equal to the balance of whatever the token is that you want to denominate it in, divided by its reserve ratio. And I know that that's a bit of a mouthful, and even though this expression down here in the bottom right is I think super self-explanatory, I think that it's worthwhile thinking about what it really means. Because when I was asked, I think at the last time I attended this meeting, what does it mean to have a bonding curve? Or what does a bonding curve refer to? The answer that I gave was something that denominates the value of something else in a self-referential way, right? In so many words. And you kind of already know this about pool tokens, even if you hadn't considered it. So for example, let's imagine that you've got a a standard Uniswap V1 liquidity pool that's got like two, let's say 10 ETH in it and 100 USDC. Now, just because of our familiarity with the with bonding curves and AMMs by now, we would know that the marginal price of ETH under that circumstance is $10. But what about the pool token, right? So if we've got 10 ETH, 100 USDC in a liquidity pool, and there have been 10 pool tokens issued against it, right? What is the price of one pool token? Yeah, well, let's do it this way. Let's say that you and I have one pool token each, and that's all the pool tokens that there are. And there's a liquidity pool with 2 ETH in it and 200 USDC. If I give up half of the liquidity pool token supply, then I get half of the liquidity that's inside that liquidity pool. And if there were 200 USDC, then I'm getting 100 USDC. I get half of whatever's there. If there's 2 ETH, I get one of those. If there's 200 USDC,
exactly. So the value of the assets in the pool are divided by the number of LP tokens. So it'd be
correct
1 ETH and 100 USDC if you had 2 ETH and 200 USDC and 2 LP tokens.
Perfect. Exactly right. So what is the value of an LP token?
Was it not the sum of the portion of the pool that it represents?
Kind of, right? So, but in this case where I said we got like, if I have half the LP token supply, and let's just say that the LP token supply is just 2. And so I give 1 token back to the pool and I get back 1 ETH and let's say 100 USDC. Then the value of that pool token, you could say, is 1 ETH and 100 USDC. But what is it in just in ETH?
In Uniswap, that'd be 2 ETH.
It'd be 2 ETH, right? And yeah, go ahead.
Or depending on the preset proportions between token A and token B in the pool.
Yes, exactly right. MD, you had your hand up for a second.
Oh, thanks, Mark. No, it's just there's so many connections here to the ETF world, and I don't know if it was inspired by the kind of innovation that ETF structure brought to traditional finance, right?
Yeah, it was actually like in the, I think the very first blog, like non-Bancor blog, that discussed the Bancor invention to like regular people. It called it an on-chain ETF, literally.
Yeah,
the point that I'm making here is that the cacophony of these different factors together, right? You end up with like the LP token. It represents both the pricing model and the account keeping system, right? In a way, the bonding curve isn't in the liquidity pool; it's kind of in the pool token, because the pool token tells you what the value of itself is in any one of those things. So in the case where we've got 2 pool tokens in existence and there's only 2 ETH in the liquidity pool and 200 USDC in the liquidity pool, I know that the value of that pool token is 2 ETH exactly, or it's also 200 USDC exactly, right? In a constant product sense, because the weights of these two things are the same. That means that 200 USDC is also equal to 2 ETH. And so I can work out the price of ETH, because if 2 ETH is equal to 200 USDC, then 1 ETH is equal to 100 USDC. And now I've got the price of ETH, right? And I know that this is doesn't get spoken about very often, but that really is the what we were trying to annex as a project. Was it's not enough that you get exchange. You also need to get price discovery, and you also need an account keeping mechanism. And it's the way that these 3 things interact together, and you have to be able to derive each one from the other. It's this kind of is the thing that has become the underpinning technology in DeFi. And so, if nothing else, I'm hoping that with this presentation, this might start to make you think about some of the things that you take for granted from a slightly different perspective. Certainly, the idea that in Uniswap's case, that the reserve ratio is provably 0.5, right? It's provably 1/2, because if you're getting because the reserves in Uniswap on a 50-50 pool is always such that the total value of ETH on one side is equal to the total value of tokens on the other side, and that is just very, very concisely captured by this really tiny equation. And I just find it to be a very satisfying way to sort of wrap up what is really a very complicated subject. And what's interesting is that you can start with this equation and derive everything that I've presented before, right? I've done it the other way because I find it more intuitive. But yeah, essentially, starting with swaps and everything and coming back down to this pool token relationship. But you can start with this equation and derive everything else in the opposite direction. The two are very much tied to the same thing. Sorry, during that call, what I was saying, I saw MD, you still had your hand up?
No, sorry. Do I have to bring it down? I didn't.
It went down. It went down.
Oh, sorry.
Octopus, you had your hand.
Octopus.
Yes, so a couple of weeks ago, we were trying to come up with like a formal definition, that would look like some tuple or something maybe. And I was looking forward to asking you today, why a bonding curve couldn't just be a person who would quote a price for any particular request, and now you've answered it without me asking. So it's
Right.
like there's a set of functions, but then there's a consistency requirement also. Is that accurate based on what you said? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like it's more about the like everything that the system does needs to be deterministic, and that everything that the system might do has to be defined, right? It's not enough. Like, for example, an iterative algorithm, I think, would be unsatisfactory. And I'm just positing this, right? I could be wrong about that. I've gotten into, like, I don't want to say arguments, but let's say debates about that, especially with some bonding curve systems that have no symbolic solutions and can only be solved iteratively. I find very frustrating. But I have to concede that I still call it a bonding curve. But yeah, I do think that it has to be deterministic, and preferentially it should have symbolic solutions. But yeah, it's if it's just someone standing somewhere quoting something, then you would have to argue that it's the laws of the universe or something that's controlling the molecules in their brain that inspire them to quote a certain price. That would be the bonding curve, not the person themselves, I think. MD.
Mark, but it's ironic because if we step back into the traditional finance world, the market makers, they're the person that Dr. P's talking about. They're the ones doing the quoting.
Yeah, so
theoretically. But because we're in a decentralized world and we want to work autonomously, we have to have a system act as that agent, right?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely right. And we can. I'm going to get much further into the weeds in that with presentation 2, and there's more to this presentation, by the way. We're not nearly done. But yeah, in presentation 2, I'm definitely going to start showing you how bonding curves can replicate, one-to-one, can be a perfect representation of what a market maker would do if they were doing their job correctly. Okay.
I'm eager to work out a graduate school text and math definition for this, if you ever have interest in doing that.
Yeah, we should work on it. Okay, let's move on with some of these other demonstrations. So what I wanted to do in this next part, and I'll try and keep this relatively brief, is show that from these what I would consider relatively benign descriptions, we can build up to much more complicated cases, and then we can also find simplifications that capture exactly the same activity, but under very special circumstances that kind of contract down some of these equations. And so I think that the best place to start is to derive the constant product equations, right? Because the ones that I've demonstrated up until now are the general case, right? They will apply to a liquidity pool with any number of tokens in them, with any reserve weights, and so on. And unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to completely finish this part of the presentation. But in retrospect, I'm actually glad for that, because it might be nice to sort of end the presentation where it's going to end. This isn't the last slide, but it will end in a few slides. And see if people want to sort of let some of the things sink in that I've said, and see if they can derive those equations themselves. And then in the beginning of presentation 2, we'll go over that derivation of constant product, and then we'll also have a look at some of the other like surprising and nice conclusions that you can get out of the mathematics. So this is the equation that you see in front of you is one that you've already seen. This is the the amount of pool tokens that are being issued in return for some number of one token that is being provided to the liquidity pool. And again, I give you this as something of a homework assignment. Derive, prove that if you're providing 2 tokens simultaneously, then this becomes the equation that describes how many pool tokens you're going to be issued in return for those tokens. Now, in this particular case, there is no special requirement that delta X and delta Y have any relationship to each other or relationship to their reserve balances. So this can be any number. You can come up to a liquidity pool with just ETH and USDC in it. Maybe there's 20 ETH and 2,000 USDC. And if you want to add 1 ETH and 1 trillion USDC, this equation will tell you how many pool tokens you're going to get in return for that interaction. So this is the general case. But of course, in the case that we are thinking about, there is a specific relationship between delta X and delta Y. And that is that the ratio delta X over XP and delta Y over YP are equal. The amount, the relative proportion that we are increasing the pool's total balance of whatever the X token is, that proportion is the same as the amount that we're increasing the Y balance by. And so under that, like once you've made that connection, then actually this part in the first set of parentheses is going to be equal to this part in the second set of parentheses. And this actually brings us to that simplification that I mentioned before when Octopus was asking me why Uniswap designed their system the way that they did, at least in the V1 case. And this is that in their smart contracts, they can force XP and DX to always be to be an ETH balance. And because of the way that Ethereum is constructed, it is more convenient to refer to an ETH balance often than it is to try and ping some smart contract somewhere to get a token balance instead. So in this case, if you are always requiring that people provide ETH and whatever the other token is in equal proportion, you can actually ignore the other token and just refer to the ETH balance, which is really nice. And that's the simplification here on the bottom of the slide. Now, something we haven't spoken about, and I know it's kind of awkward to put it in here right now, and I promise you we'll come back and address this in a future in part 2 of this seminar series. But in general, we prefer it when all of the reserve weights for each one of the different tokens that comprise a liquidity pool add up to 1. Right. So in Uniswap's case, RX and RY are both 0.5, right? And you add those together, you get 1. In Balance's case, you might have an 80-20 pool, so it's 0.2 and 0.8. Or you could have, a 6-dimensional pool where it might be like 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, 0.2, and so on. So these can be any number. And it doesn't actually change too much if we allow it to be literally any sum. So instead of being, everything adding up to 1, we could say everything adds up to 2 or pi or whatever. It doesn't really change the way that the system behaves, except for the interaction that users have with each other with respect to who is getting the fair share of the liquidity pool. So when we set this number to 1, It just means that there is no advantage or disadvantage to being the first to provide liquidity. When this number is greater than 1, there is an advantage to being the first in the liquidity pool and a disadvantage to being late. And it effectively means people have to, there's this bias where people who are adding liquidity after you have to add more and more and more. It is basically this diminishing return profile on the LP token issuance. And so to avoid obvious exploits and other things, in general, everyone's just agreed that these reserve weights should always be equal to 1. And that's beautiful in this case, because if we replace the exponent here with just number 1, then this thing falls down into something that's really quite pleasant. And so this is getting very, very close now to the constant product or the familiar AMM LP token issuance. And you can see again that this idea of a pro rata share is kind of falling out just naturally. So what you're looking at here is that the total amount of pool tokens that are being issued, that are being created in response to someone providing, remember, this was actually 2 tokens. We've just simplified it down because we know that they have the same relative proportion with respect to the number of tokens that are already present in the liquidity pool. So this delta Z value is just telling you that you are going to get some number of pool tokens that is equal to the total supply of pool tokens that there are multiplied by whatever that proportion is, whatever that proportionality constant is. And so this means that we can just divide through by the total balance and see that when there's a liquidity addition event, that the change in the overall pool token supply, under the condition that it's, that you're adding all of the tokens in the liquidity pool and it's always proportional to their current balance, that change in the pool token liquidity supply is always equal to the change in the reserve balance of all of these other tokens, right? So this, this could be 100 tokens in this pool, and as long as they're all increasing by the same amount, then whatever that proportion is going to be equal to the proportion that we increase the pool token supply by, and that means that we're now in a situation where instead of getting that bent pool token issuance profile, it's now a perfectly straight line. So those two different curves that I presented earlier, where one was kind of asymptotic somewhere up here, and the other one looked like it was asymptotic down here, or maybe it looked like a little bit parabolic. I think they're both technically square root profile, but it's almost like when you combine those two curves together, they cancel each other out perfectly, and you get this perfectly straight line. And that is the system that was used by, or that was required by Uniswap v1 and Uniswap v2. And so that just means that if I double, like if there's a liquidity pool with ETH and USDC in it, and I double the amount of ETH and USDC, then the pool token supply will also double, and I will get the tokens that are owed. If I increase the liquidity in the pool by 10% without changing the price, then the pool token supply will also increase by 10%, and I will get that. And so in a way, this is, I think, this is helpful when you're sort of teaching people about bonding curves for the first time, because that's like the most intuitive way to think about this account keeping system. Whereas the single token issuance and withdrawal can be a little bit more counterintuitive. What about removing liquidity? I'll fly through this one because it's exactly the same process. You can take that same, that same expression from before and just add the y component. And again, this is something that I leave for homework, is to prove that this equation is true based on the equations that I presented above. And we can do that same simplification. If the relative decrease in x and y is equal, then the first set of parentheses becomes equal to the second set of parentheses. We can solve this expression for the reserve weights totaling 1, and we can get to that same that same relationship, and we end up with the exact same pro rata expression, this time in reverse. And so if we graph that, now it's, as pool tokens go into the pool, if we are receiving pool tokens back, and it's we're receiving a composition that's equal to the composition of the pool, then again, it's a perfectly straight line. So yeah, it can totally expected, nothing unexpected there. Okay, so now we need to talk about swaps, because you'll notice that by now, the only thing that I've spoken about is this concept of someone providing either one token or multiple tokens to a pool in return for a pool token, or the reverse, someone providing a pool token to a pool in return for one or some combination of tokens in return from that pool. And this is the interesting part of it, is that those functions, when Bancor were released, I think they were restricted to known addresses. So the act of providing liquidity and removing liquidity could only be done by project teams. And this is because we were regulated by FINMA, and they thought that the system that we had invented really was just an exchange. And it is, right? And so we were regulated and are continuing to be regulated as an exchange. There is no difference between, we don't get sort of the benefit of the doubt, right? We're kind of treated a little bit like DeFi, like they do give us some passes with respect to sort of KYC and other things because of the way that the system's set up. But, at the time, if you wanted to create a liquidity pool in Bancor, we would fax you the forms and you would have to fill them out. Which means that, who is trading, right? So we could pipe together the function of adding liquidity and removing liquidity, so that if you weren't on this whitelist, that you would be in the unique position, or you would be, restricted from basically terminating your liquidity interaction halfway through. Meaning that if you're adding liquidity, we force you to then remove liquidity at the same time, right? And they have to come together. And so by piping those things together, you get these expressions. And again, I leave this as homework. I actually do have the proofs. And so I'm thinking what I might do is kind of put some of these proofs together and issue them as like a Word document or something. But I think that it is very nourishing to the intellect to actually take some of the expressions that I've shown you and come to these answers yourself. But in this situation, the top one might feel familiar to people that have had a good look at, for example, the balancer contracts recently. So here we're saying, if we give a certain number of tokens to the pool, we know that we're going to be issued LP tokens as a result of that interaction. But then we're immediately putting that LP token back into the pool and taking all of its value out from the other token on the other side. And so this effectively performs exchange. And because this is an arbitrageable function, it allows for price discovery and, should equilibrate with the market over time, and it does. And the rest is history. So these two functions are slightly different. The first one is if I want to sell a certain amount of a token, then this is the right one to choose. So what this means is, if I've got like 1 ETH and I'm trying to sell that ETH and I want to calculate how many USDC I will get in return, this top function is the one to use. It will, all of your inputs are on this side, and it will say this is the amount of USDC that you're getting back. The bottom function is the opposite. This is I want to get exactly 100 USDC in return from the pool. How many ETH do I need to provide? But note that all of the LP tokens cancel out, and this is the expression that you're left with. And this is the some of the original swap equations that you would have seen in the sort of 2017, 2018 literature, and still appears in white papers today as people, I think, sort of like rediscover some of these relationships for themselves. And I assume it to be novel. And so here we're starting to find, some more familiar looking bonding curves. This is not quite yet the invariant curve that we're used to, but this is the price curve, which is not as commonly presented, but is equally important. So what you're looking at here is as I push X into this system, how much Y do I get in return? And you can see it has this diminishing return profile, as it should. And this is going to approach the asymptote at whatever the current balance of Y is in the liquidity pool, right? You can't possibly extract more of the Y token balance than is present. But what it's also showing you is that actually we can't, we can only ever get close to that number. It's actually impossible to get the balance of Y tokens all the way to zero. We can only approach it with arbitrarily large amounts of whatever the X token is that we're pushing into the system. Okay, and so this now means that we so the last exercise, the last demonstration before I conclude this talk is to then have a look at oracle prices, which is arguably one of the most important functions of an AMM, right? Price discovery. And we've kind of spoken about it already, right? We know that on a Uniswap V2 curve, if you've got a token and there's 10 of them, and there's a USDC, a stable coin in the other reserve, and there's 10 times as many, we know that that first token is worth $10. But why do we know that, right? Because it's not like, if we actually tried to perform that swap, we also know that we don't get whatever that marginal price is, we get some other price, right? Some observed price because of slippage and so on. And so what I wanted to do is have a look at where that marginal price comes from, like how we have come to take that for granted. And I will leave it, I think, for the next presentation to then get into sort of the swap equations themselves and what they mean, what we mean by slippage, what we mean by price impact and everything else. So the only thing that we need to do here is to take the limit as the token that we're either extracting from the liquidity pool or sending into the liquidity pool goes to zero. That's it. So this is that same swap equation that you saw before, and all I'm doing is taking the partial differential at X equals zero, right? And substituting this out. And what you'll get is this really, I think, surprisingly satisfying contraction of all of these different terms. And you'll see that I've deliberately represented it this way. You'll see this depending on which white paper you're reading or who's presenting it, but you'll sometimes see it as a fraction of fractions. You'll sometimes see the RY component multiplied by the being a part of the multiplicative in the denominator, and the RX being in the numerator, and so on. I find this representation just to be the most pleasing because it means that all of the everything kind of stays together on the top of the expression and on the bottom of the expression, so that the reserve weight of the Y token and the balance of the Y token in the liquidity pool sort of are on the top. And then similarly, the reserve weighting of the X token and the balance of the X token are on the bottom. And then the same in reverse. And so this is that, that familiar price quote function. And remember what I said, that in Uniswap's case, both, it's always a 2-token pool, and the reserve weights were always 1/2. Which means that RY and RX are the same number. And so this is just 1. And so this means that the marginal price in this direction is just the balance of one token in the pool divided by the other token in the pool. And so now you've got how to get there. And it's and a new appreciation for the fact that it's only in this one very special circumstance that when the reserve weights are identical, that you can just take one reserve and divide it by the other reserve to get the marginal price. It only works under that situation. It doesn't have to be half, by the way. It could be that both of these numbers are 1 or both of these numbers are 10 or whatever, like I said before, if we ignore the liquidity providing and removal hack. But this is where that oracle price quote comes from. And now we're going to get to the very, very, very last component. Oh, Octopus, have you got your hand up?
No, I was clapping.
Okay, so this is the very end, and I think this is the food for thought before, as a prelude to the next presentation, which is that you've actually now got enough information to construct an invariant, right? I haven't actually presented one, but there is one. And it's starting just from those three equations that we began this presentation with that you can construct everything with. But the thing that the industry has chosen to sort of rally behind as being like the definitive thing that defines how an AMM operates, what defines what a bonding curve is equations of this sort, right? That x times y equals some constant. And it's typical to use k. I've deliberately not used k because it should actually be k squared in this case, and you can see that now, I think, for the first time. But you can also represent it in the logarithmic sense, which I actually find to be a little bit more helpful, especially when you're looking at bonding curves that have non-equal ratios, right? So instead of the lovely 50-50 hyperbola, what it actually looks like to be this like compacted down hyperbola. And you'll remember that Octopus earlier in the presentation asked about the scale of one of the curves that I had drawn, and I said, yeah, but because I've left the numbers off of the scale, it's always going to be true because we'll always be able to sort of just rescale the axes in order to make it in order to make that representation true. And this logarithmic representation of a bonding curve, of a standard bonding curve, I find to be just so satisfying because it's just always a straight line. The hyperbola representation, I mean, I get it. It's certainly when you want to think about the gradient at a certain point and measure a marginal price and things, this is definitely the one that you want to be using. But at the same time, being able to see how these different curves are really just straight lines that intersect each other at one point in space on a logarithmic scale, I find to be, again, like deeply satisfying. So this is where I'm going to end the talk. I expected that this was going to be about 90 minutes, and it looks like it was. And so I apologize. A lot of that was to try and get some of the nomenclature and syntax conventions out of the way with this presentation. So I'm hoping that in the future presentations where we're going to be able to save some time and just kind of jump right into it. But yeah, thank you for your attention. And I promise that if this felt a little bit remedial, that some of the stuff that we're going to get into in presentation 2 and certainly presentation 3 is going to be a lot more challenging. But yeah, with respect to all of the homework, comments that I mentioned, through the presentation, I will have, those proofs for you, and I'm just going to give them to Rabbit as like a Word document, and he can distribute them. So if you want to do it, just know that I'm not going to leave you hanging. There will actually be some catharsis to that eventually. But thank you. Are there any questions? Octopus.
Oh, I'm very appreciative of the talk, and I did have a question for systems like the earlier versions of Uniswap and like Bancor that have a distinguished pool token. I'm kind of struck by the fact that the math is symmetric and doesn't distinguish the role of that pool token in any way. I'm wondering, is there any possibility to break the symmetry and do something to protect the pool token, or is that a bad idea for some reason?
Can you elaborate for me?
So for instance, Bancor could, I think, enforce price, like spot price restrictions by not doing X and Y treated the same, but saying X is one equation and Y is another. Like we've talked a bit about asymmetric bonding curves on Mint versus Burn previously in this group. So
right.
I'm thinking about symmetry versus symmetry breaking towards a specific bias.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm going to present, I think in the next presentation, is going to be the asymmetric bonding curves that we've developed for carbon. But it's not asymmetric in the sense that in the sense that you mean that they're asymmetric. So I think correct me if I'm wrong. I just want to make sure that I've understood it perfectly. That rather than have like one like a single function with like it can have different variables, sure. But rather than have like one function that determines how a pool token is issued or redeemed, you would rather have a set of equations that describe how the pool token is issued and redeemed with respect to one token, and then like a completely different set of functions that describe it for a different token.
Yes, probably the functions would be similar, but maybe with like a tax, for instance. So it's harder to withdraw one than the other.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you could do that. And in fact, I think I remember seeing in the Uniswap V1 contracts, there was a liquidity provider tax that was never used. And I can't remember how it was implemented, but what you're suggesting, I mean, in Uniswap's case, it would never matter. But yeah, okay, even in you could do it for something like Banco V1 very easily. So what you could say is that, for example, when providing liquidity, the tokens are just taken wholesale. But when you are removing liquidity, there is like a fee taken from the liquidity provider at the time that they remove it. And if you wanted to, you absolutely could attach that fee, like make that fee variable with respect to the token that's being withdrawn, which in a way would be identical to something like Balancer today, but having a fee that is dependent on the specific route that you're trading through. So imagine you've got a balancer pool with tokens A, B, C, D, and E. And when you trade A to B, there's a different fee to trading like A to C or C to B or E to B or whatever. That's very easy to implement. It wouldn't actually need the underlying like bonding curve to be changed because the way that fees affect the bonding curve is to sort of it takes away that perfectly reversible nature of them. And so yeah, by applying a very large fee on one of those directions, would achieve that kind of asymmetry that you're referring to. I think that people would still be like, there would always be like an optimal route where you could get like some arbitrarily depressed fee level. So in the case that we just mentioned, where maybe the swapping A directly for E gives you a relatively high fee, you might find that trading A to B, B to C, and then D, and then C to D and D to E, if each one of those has a relatively small fee, then you could get a much better deal than the direct trade. We actually have a similar arbitrage in the system that we've deployed with Carbon today, because the fee that we charge is dependent on the function that you call, and it's not it's not financially motivated. It's just about like making the contracts as small and as efficient as they can be. And so in our system, if you are measuring the amount of like the target asset that you're going to be extracting from the liquidity pool, that's the one that we take the fee from. But if you then take that quote and then transform it into, say, okay, I want to buy this exact amount, calculate how many tokens I need to provide in order to get that amount, you'll actually get a slightly better deal. And it's exactly the same as taking, whether or not you take the fee from the target asset during a trade or from the source asset during the trade. These are not financially equivalent. Because in one sense, one of them, the price is the price of one of those things is going up during the trade. And so if you allow that price to change and then take the fee, you technically get better value for the protocol. Whereas if you take the fee from the source asset, you're taking it prior to its price change. So you're taking like 10% and then allowing the price to change, allowing its price to drop. So you get slightly worse value that way. But yeah, these are sort of, the way that fee systems interact with bonding curves isn't, it doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying function that describes the thing has to change. Like if you want to use the same invariant for everything, I think it's a totally reasonable approach. But then, yeah, basically applying a dynamic or adjustable fee based on a specific function call or the specific path that someone's taking through the system. It's kind of like, adding different color filters or something onto over a scene. You get a slightly different effect. And yeah, we'll explore more of these concepts, I promise, in the next 2 lectures. Was that a satisfactory response, by the way? Or?
Yeah, well, and to give you some context, we spent a few weeks discussing specifically an augmented bonding curve. And there, the mint and burn curves are different, and the intention is partially to protect the price and partially to accumulate to a pool. So I don't have a very cogent response at the moment, but I'm kind of trying to piece together those different attributes of the translation between the different systems.
Yeah, we can definitely explore that. One of the things that I've tried to point out, continually trying to point out, is that the idea of like a fee on an AMM is actually a farce, right? No one, like, it sounds like a bold statement, but I promise you this is provably true. No one has ever paid a fee for any trading on any AMM in the history of blockchains. They just haven't, because the way that it works is that the AMM just reports a price, right? That's kind of inclusive of the fee level. So it's like asking, is there a difference if I sell you my PlayStation for $100 and I'm going to get that $100 and you're going to get a PlayStation? Is there a difference between that situation and me selling you my PlayStation for $80 and charging a $20 fee on top? In both of these situations, it's completely redundant, right? You get a PlayStation either way, and I get $100 either way. So this idea of there being a fee is actually made up. It's not there financially. It's not there mathematically. It's just a different way to report the price. But it also means that because the fee is there, the way that we present bonding curves is also inaccurate. Because the way that we draw from bonding curves is always assuming a zero fee. And the curve does change its shape a little bit when you start to account for the fee and that kind of thing. So I think that, this is at least similar because you're applying a fee during the issuance of the pool token. And I wanted to bring up this slide. So you could imagine here, this is for removing liquidity. We could very easily just add a modifier to this, right? Where we say multiply this by 1 minus some small amount, where that small amount is like the burning fee for this thing, and that would it would change this function. It would give you a new curve. But it's really it's kind of the same underlying function. It's just that we're now adding more detail to the end of it that's going to sort of push it over a little bit or shrink it down a little bit and that kind of thing. But you've inspired me because I think that we can return to these equations and see what it would look like with different minting and different burning taxes on it. And put together like a Desmos calculator or something and see what shapes we get. But the good news is that in all of those systems, I don't think that there's no like exploits or anything like that. It's just it's just going to be how how you decide to quote to the user of the system specifically what it is that they're buying, what activity there is, and what their expectations are. And so, yeah, if there's some, if it's some financial instrument, then you might have to say, look, if you leave too early, like if you leave before maturity, you're not going to get back as much money as you put in. But, and maturity is dependent on, how well that instrument performs. So if there's like a $10 or 10%, burning tax or something, then you know that you need to at least break, a 10% return before it makes financial sense to withdraw from the system, however long that takes. So yeah, it's totally reasonable. It's just, it's more about you've got like the bonding curve, if you like, is like the chassis, and you're kind of just adding further modifications on top of it to change like the color or change the shape.
Yeah, that
Thanks,
definitely tracks with the work that we did with the augmented bonding curve in the Common Stack Token Engineering Commons. And I don't want to jump the line here because I know there's a couple of hands up, but one of the things maybe we can discuss further next time along the same lines of this question is the focus on primary AMMs versus secondary AMMs. And there's even, it's funny because there's both primary and secondary issuance within the one that you're showing right here. The LP token is essentially the primary issuance, and that the secondary is, your ETH, your USDC. So I understand we're kind of splitting hairs and with some of these definitions, but I do feel that some of the requirements of a system for like a primary issuance of a native token may lend itself to things like adding a fee or some of these asymmetries to incur value or drive value to a pool, which can be spent perhaps by using the tokens themselves. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts on primary and secondary AMMs and maybe where some of those requirements differ. But I don't want to jump the line here. So I know Sean probably has some interesting questions too. I just wanted to note that because I think it fit in with Octopus's question there.
Yeah, wonderful. And yeah, I'm interested. Before we move on, just while we're on the topic, how would you define the difference between a primary and a secondary AMM? I read this on, I think it was a member of this group wrote a Medium article about augmented bonding curves and like the definition of bonding curves, and it was quite beautiful. And I remember seeing the definitions there, but I can't quite remember it. Would you mind refreshing my memory?
Yeah, I just dropped the article in the chat here. That was a few of us worked on that. Rabbit, Jess, myself, and I mean lots of input from bonding curve folks around the space. But I just dropped it in the chat there.
Perfect, thank you. MD, I think you were next.
Oh, I was just going to Dr. P always has interesting questions, and if I go back to your example, if I could just throw out a different perspective, Mark, if you think of the metadata, the construction of your example, whether you buy something, your PlayStation for X, and you don't charge a tax, or you charge X and then you charge a tax, from a recording perspective, those are two different things.
Correct.
And if you're doing like cost analysis, like P&L, which, if we're talking about assets exchanging, I would presume this is financial assets, then the P&L would be affected by that example that you.
Well, I mean,
like a tax
maybe
on transaction or fees.
What
is
what
a
if I
bucket
don't
that is tracked?
Yeah, but what if I don't tell you which one it was?
Oh, totally fair. And again, I'm only throwing out the suggestion that there's a secondary layer, like a derivative, where you could actually start utilizing the metadata, or the metadata is needed for the accounting purpose of something else, like a P&L, right? Like what I paid and what I sold, how much I'm charged. Like it kind of, if you're trying to run a strategy to calculate your performance, your costs, these kind of things might really affect your like alpha generation, metrics. Do you know what I mean, Mark?
Yeah, yeah,
I don't want to go
absolutely,
on
I
a
do.
wild goose chase, but it was just something that
No,
Dr. P
it's
asked, you suggested.
yeah, it's not a wild goose chase at all. And the yeah, so let's talk about this for 30 seconds because it's definitely worth exploring. Let's say, okay, at the moment, the reason why I'm very confident when I say that no one's ever paid a fee on these things is because there is just like an input and an output, right? And you can see in the function that there is this like fee parameter, but on the blockchain, all you see is that someone, gave a PlayStation and received $100, right? And it's not denominated in how much of that was a fee or whatever. And this is what I meant by when I said, what if I don't tell you what my fee was? Because neither does the blockchain, neither do the contracts. They just tell you what was the output that was calculated from the input that the user gave it. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. And there's two different ways that you can go about it. One is that you can actually just look at how the contracts are written and be like, oh, I can back calculate the fee. So if I know the input and I know the output, then the fee had to be this. And so you could have some off-chain implementation that actually, reconstructs the fees from it. And this might, in some tax jurisdictions, for example, might make a difference because you might say that, the fee that you paid while trading might be considered like a cost of doing business. And so being able to compute that for reporting sake is actually worthwhile. If you wanted that as a part of the metadata, also totally achievable because that off-chain component that I just spoke about, you could just bring on-chain, right? As a make it a part of the smart contract. And then instead of sending, tokens once, you send them twice, or you include it, as you suggest, as a part of the metadata associated with that transaction. So it'd be part of the log or whatever it is. The problem is that most smart contract engineers, especially the ones on Ethereum, they will see that and they will immediately simplify the code to get rid of that metadata if it doesn't affect the transaction. And the reason is that the gas consumption of the transaction becomes much, much less efficient. The more numbers that need to be computed and stored and read and written, and it can blow out of proportion pretty quickly. So most people will prefer to instead create a very, very lightweight, very bare bones smart contract implementation, and then offer a very sophisticated software development kit that can recreate those things, after the fact. But it's an excellent point because you should consider, we're not a smart contract group, right? We're a bonding curve group, and so these things should be considered two parts of like the same process. But it's just worth pointing out that from an implementation perspective, I think separating the stuff that must be on the smart contract and the things that should be off chain is a very healthy way to think about exactly the concept that you're wrestling with at the moment.
Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure. Sean.
Hey, thanks, Mark. I've really enjoyed the presentation and I love how you slides laid out. I really like the design.
Thank you.
My question is, I thought it was so interesting at the end how you moved into the log space and everything, all the curves just became linear. That's so cool. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of deeper implications working in the log space with bonding curves? I'm wondering, could this whole presentation be done in the log space? Would that simplify things or
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, some things are actually, like, I would say, like in terms of notation, some of these formulas are actually easier to express as like a logarithm. And you'll find that often, especially when you are like trying to solve like some really complicated like questions. I've wondered if I might actually present some in this lecture series where we can look at, for example, the ideal sandwich attack, right? Like if assuming zero fees or assuming an arbitrary fee, whatever we want it to be, if someone is going to be a trade on one of these bonding curves, and you need to front run them, let their transaction through, and then back run both transactions, these kinds of problems become very, very difficult to solve when you're using like arbitrary weights, and getting the exponent out of that thing. So rather than dealing with the powers on this side where we've got the hyperbola, and just bringing them down and just letting them be, things that we multiply the logarithm of something else by, everything can get much, much easier to deal with. But then the problem is that if you get in the habit of using the logarithm, you find that that when you come to sort of designing your smart contract system, you kind of want to use logarithms. And using logarithms on Ethereum is like, you should never try it. The precision loss that you get on, because remember, everything on Ethereum is fixed point. And the algorithm that you have to run in order to compute, the natural logarithm of something is extremely gas intensive. Like you would very, very quickly become like the most expensive contract on Ethereum if you're doing it this way. So yeah, in terms of like, these are the same statement, right? So like in terms of, if you had a very, very deep understanding of mathematics, or, your erudition is such that your brain can flip between these two things seamlessly, then, good for you. But for the rest of us, I actually do think that treating things in the logarithmic sense makes a lot of the equations just a lot friendlier, a lot easier to solve, and a lot more intuitive. But at the risk of getting too complacent in that system, and when you come to actually have to define these things on smart contracts, getting back into like reversing these things can be horrible. And I have been in situations where you need to use the product log, the Lambert W function, in order to get out of your logarithmic case and back into the power case, and it can it can add unnecessary obstacles. So generally, and this is speaking as a developer, as a programmer, you should probably stick to expressions that you're in the same format that you're likely to be using them. But if you're just exploring stuff, right? If you're just trying to sink your teeth into the mathematics and its meaning, then absolutely move into the logarithmic space. You'll find that suddenly a lot of these concepts become a lot more intuitive.
Very cool. Thank you for that.
My pleasure. MD, you still got your hand up? Or was that still left up from moments ago?
Yes, sir. Sorry, I don't know why it's not.
Oh, that's fine. No problem, mate. I just wanted to ask just in case. Well, thank you so much for your attention. I think we're up to almost 2 hours. So I apologize for taking up so much of your evening. But I very much enjoyed speaking with you all again, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 presentations.